Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. A tidal wave of baby boomers are approaching the traditional age of retirement, but they're too healthy, too motivated, and not wealthy enough just to play golf for the rest of their projected long lives. Many are ready for a transition, and many are looking for meaning, not just money, from their work. There'll be more than 78 million American baby boomers that are now beginning to retire, and one survey this year by a research institute found that half of the boomers are interested in starting new careers with a positive social impact. That comes from the New York Times. Nicholas Kristof is talking about baby boomers and deciding they don't want to just kind of sit around and maybe do a little bit of traveling and take the easy route, but they actually want to apply themselves in the second half of their lives. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a couple who did just that. They retired from Silicon Valley and decided to upstart into Swaziland. From Silicon Valley to Swaziland is the book, and it's how one couple found purpose and adventure and an Encore career. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guests, Rick and Wendy Walleigh. Rick, Wendy, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
You bet. Now, why Swaziland?
Okay, a lot of people ask that, and
I think mainly because they've never heard of it, probably.
yeah, well, I knew approximately where it was. I knew that it bordered South Africa, but I didn't know exactly where. And a lot of people say, how did you pick Swaziland? And we said, well, we didn't pick Swaziland. Swaziland picked us. We had decided to do volunteer work with an organization called TechnoServe, whose tagline is Business Solutions to Poverty. And when we submitted our resumes to them, they sent it out to their country directors in Africa. And the first one to write back and say, I've got jobs for both of you, was the country director from Swaziland. So that's how we got to Swaziland.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell us, first of all, what it is when you go to, how you two came to decide to move in that direction. I mean, you know, you're retired, you're probably doing fairly well enough, and then you decide to start a second career. What was burning with inside both of you that made you decide to do something like this?
Well, I actually started first. I had been in high-tech marketing and sales for many years, and I just decided didn't want to sell one more piece of software or hardware, so I approached getting a more meaningful career, used a career coach, talked with a lot of people, networked, blah, 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 and then ended up connecting with 3 out of 4 of my top passions, which were education, entrepreneurship, and women and youth, and then connected with junior achievement locally in Silicon Valley. I ended up being on the board and then working for them for 4 years. So I made that transition first. I'll let Rick explain his approach.
Sure.
So a few years later, then it was my turn. I decided I'd had enough of this as well, and I wanted to do something more socially beneficial. And I started exploring, because I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And I decided, well, at this point in my life, there are no constraints. I can think big. I can go do whatever I want. So I decided I would tackle world peace through the elimination of poverty. Now, I didn't expect to do it all by myself, but I thought I could make a contribution there. And through a lot of reading and a lot of networking, I found TechnoServe, who I mentioned before, has the tagline of Business Solutions to Poverty. Their approach and my views and my background aligned pretty well as with Wendy's, and they had a volunteer program, and so we decided that that's the direction we'd go.
Now, it must have been quite a culture shock as you went over to that part of Africa, wasn't it?
Well, it was surprisingly less than you might think.
Oh, okay.
Because we weren't dealing with living in a rural village in mud huts. I mean, we were in a small city, but it could have been a small city anywhere in kind of rural U.S., either in the Midwest or the South or something like that. All the people there were Africans, and there were slight differences, but there were still small businesses. There were people who were trying to make a living, wanted to have better lives for their families, etc. So it was different, but not a huge culture shock.
Yeah, I would say that I had kind of volunteered to go along with Rick to do this kind of developing world kind of efforts, but I wanted to make sure that 4 criteria were met. I didn't want to have flying bullets. I didn't want to go to a country with Stan in its name, also related to flying bullets. And then I wanted to have flush toilets and hot showers. So those 4 criteria had to be met wherever it was we were going to end up going. And we lived in Swaziland in what was kind of a cute little cottage that had a lovely view of a valley in front of it. So it was not a mud hut, and we were not in the middle of nowhere. So that was actually a relatively easy transition. Lots of other challenges in lots of other ways, but that part wasn't that hard.
You know, it's funny, Wendy, because you have the same prerequisites as my wife does just for a camping trip.
Wow.
There's got to be a hot shower.
Yeah, well,
okay.
Hopefully you're not going to any conflict zones.
Now, what's really interesting is that you talk about in your book about business development over there was a little bit slower than it tended to be in the United States. Tell us about that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, particularly coming from Silicon Valley, where you get an idea, you pull a bunch of people together, you work 24 hours a day, you get some money, and the idea either goes or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you vacate the building, you sell the furniture, and you move on to your next venture. And it doesn't happen that way in Africa typically. A lot of poor people in the world, about 3/4 of the desperately poor people in the world are smallholder farmers. And so the agricultural world moves at a slower pace than the high-tech Silicon Valley world. And so things move a bit slower over there, and it takes a little longer to get things done, and the infrastructure and the government structure are not quite as accommodating, and so there are a lot of hurdles to overcome a lot of times when you're starting a business or trying to get something done. So that provides a lot of challenges for us and for the people who are living and working there as well.
Yeah, I found that interesting because it was about a year ago I talked with a gentleman who went over to Europe, specifically France, to develop the retail outlet malls that we have here in the United States. And, you know, here he's trying to push and move things along and realizes that people in France, they pretty much have a different clock that is more like 48 hours more than 24 hours. You know, and he says, you know, in America they micromanage and, you know, they move things along and they get things done, but over in France they kind of get around to doing things when they're ready to get around doing it. And you kind of found that to be the case here, didn't you?
Absolutely. There's an expression that was in a movie several years ago, Blood Diamond, and it was called TIA, This is Africa. And pretty much all the Africans shrug their shoulders and say TIA, or This is Africa. So everybody kind of acknowledges a much slower pace of doing everything, and most Africans are okay with that. I think it's most frustrating for those of us from the U.S. Who work at a much faster pace and expect results and are very direct in our requests and in our expectations.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel that changed you as you began to, I guess, get into the rhythm of that pace?
Well, I always struggled with that because a lot of times it presented a lack of customer orientation or customer service. And so I never knew, well, do I go along with this and just accept that this is the way that the society is over here? do I push to get something changed and act like this white outsider coming in from someplace who doesn't understand the local culture? And so it was a constant struggle in my mind as to how to react. And sometimes I pushed, and sometimes I was just complacent, and I never really resolved what the right response should be.
And I would say that was true in my activities. I think because I was dealing with establishing a new program in Swaziland, which ended up being Junior Achievement of Swaziland. But the youth program was brand new concept, and that makes it even harder. I think, again, in Silicon Valley and in the U.S. business, people expect new concepts. People expect new things, and kind of old hat to have something that's even a year old. The idea of new concepts is very alien, and so it takes more time to persuade. And I would say the other thing besides the new concept is it's very relationship driven. Everybody knows everybody or wants to know everybody, so kind of trusts you more, and you have to establish those relationships. So it took us time to do that as well, even though TechnoServe was established in Swaziland and certainly well established in Kenya. They still were building relationships, and we had to do that as well and accept the pace at which that happened.
Now, you were describing, there's a lot of adventures certainly to be had in this particular endeavor here, but there was one particular story, and I don't know why this one stuck out in my mind, but I think having been overseas, you can kind of understand this perspective. But you were talking about how you were on your way for a nice cup of Portuguese coffee, and you had to decide where to go get it by how readily available you can watch your vehicle.
Yeah.
That was in Mozambique. Go ahead, Rick.
Yes. Yes, that I mean, you have to get adjusted to these facts of life. I mean, we were with friends, and we had to be able to watch the vehicle while we were having the cup of coffee so that nothing was stolen. In living in Nairobi, we lived in a compound. It was surrounded by an 8-foot-high wall with electrified barbed wire above it, and a big metal gate with guards. But during the day, you could go outside the compound, feel very comfortable walking around. There was a shopping center, not a little mall, not less than a mile away. Walk around there, people are very comfortable. It just, at night, everything would be locked up, and if you went out, you'd get picked up by the taxi inside your compound, and then you'd be dropped off inside the compound of your friends or a restaurant or what have you. So, but you just get used to that. It just goes into the background, and that as long as you pay attention and follow the rules, you'll be safe.
Now, I know that as you were talking about business development in your book, I kind of was reminded of a lot of friends here in the United States. You know, they get a great business idea, and they think that people are just going to flock and do business with them, or banks are going to turn money over. And it seems that they sort of have that same thinking over there, don't they?
Yeah, there's a lack of sophistication around finance, particularly, once again, the contrast from Silicon Valley over to many places in Africa. Silicon Valley has this huge venture capital community, and if you have a high-growth business opportunity that you are proposing, you can get equity funding. But two things are different over there. One is they don't have that kind of venture capital community, and the kind of businesses that they're typically proposing over there are not the high-growth Googles, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. As I say, a lot of people work in agriculture, and those businesses don't tend to be high-growth, high-return. And so it's not something that a bank is willing to invest in unless you have some collateral to back up that loan.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell us about some of the businesses you were helping to develop over there.
Well, one that I worked with was a business that wanted to pressure treat wooden poles for telephone poles or electric poles. And another one, I worked with the pork industry, piggeries. I worked with one entrepreneur wanted to start a bottled water company, and I had to convince him that since there were already between 8 and 10 bottled water companies already existing, that it didn't really make sense to start another one. He thought that since he had some nice land and a good supply of clean water, that bottled water would be a good business. And I had to explain to him that it had nothing to do with the water. It was all about the marketing and the distribution. And he hadn't really thought those through very well. And so the whole business community over there was much less sophisticated than we would find here in the U.S.
But I would also say that entrepreneurs across the world are similar in that they have an area of passion that they want to create their business around, and then everything else is kind of secondary, which people should understand, and they've built a better mousetrap, so people should flock to their door. So there is that commonality as well as the fact that these people are willing to work 24 hours a day and are driven to make their businesses successful. So those are the other commonalities that I think they do have with entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the U.S.
That must have been very exciting, too, to work with people who were willing to put that kind of effort into seeing something develop and then grow into something versus somebody who might just kind of make an effort. They think it's a great idea, but as we know, any of us who started our first business, we realize, wow, this kind of takes a little sweat equity here to get it going and a lot of patience as well before it really catches on and develops. And sometimes, or in a fair amount of times, people just quit or they go find something else to do. And it seems in America we have that kind of a luxury to be able to go do that. But in Africa, it's a little bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And the consequences of not succeeding are probably much greater in Africa than they are in the U.S. In Silicon Valley, if you have a great idea, you work at it really hard, and then for perhaps no fault of your own or maybe fault of your own, it doesn't take off, you can quit that business and you can go start up another one, and people won't hold that against you. But if you do that in Africa, the consequences of not being successful are usually pretty severe. I mean, you've lost a lot of money. It was your money or your friend's money or your relative's money, and it wasn't the venture capitalist money, and now you have to go off and figure out something else to do, either start another business, which would be even more difficult, or get a job, which is always a challenge in Africa as well.
Mm-hmm. It's also fascinating when you think about how things are just a little bit different when you're traveling outside of an area that you're so used to, that you grew up in. And just recently I was interviewing with a lady that talks about how to understand doing business in Asia and Asian cultures and the different types of Asian cultures. And I had some direct experience with Japanese executives. And, one of the things you don't do is you don't shake hands. You bow.
Right.
They don't believe that you touch. And then there's also a way that you ask for something. You more become inquisitive about that something, so it's offered to you. And even more importantly, when you have a group of executives, there's the main executive, and there's a specific place that he sits, and no one sits down until he sits first. And if you're being served a meal, he is always the one that is served first. And so you find these interesting nuances, but they're very important for these cultures to be able to be consistent with. One of the things I thought was funny, and I just couldn't even imagine sitting through this, were business speeches.
Yes.
Tell us about that, because I was thinking, I could totally relate to what you guys were experiencing and talking about here, but I thought, I just hope I don't have to live through something like that more than once.
Yeah. Anytime you are at an event and you give a speech, you have to honor the guests who are there.
Every single one of them.
Yes, the important guests. And,
the important guests.
And like you said, in the Japanese culture, you have to honor them in order of their importance. So it's Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Secretary of State, Mr. Local congressman, whatever, but it has to be hierarchical. And it can take a few minutes at the beginning of any speech to honor all these people, but it is very important to do that culturally. Relationships
are very important, and honoring and respecting is very important. Westerners, particularly in the U.S., we're so direct. We just, blurt out whatever it is we want and expect those results to happen. It is very different in the order, as Rick said, the hierarchical and the honoring, but it's also, in general, very important to build relationships, and that takes time, and that contributes to the slower pace of everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Now, what I was surprised about was race and racism when you were talking about that in the book. Kind of describe for our listeners what was going on with that.
Well, that was particularly true in South Africa. We got a very different perspective on race there because in the U.S., we talk about people who are black or white, and we don't talk about people who are of mixed race. And in South Africa, they talk about people that are all white, that in their background, that are all black in their background, and then they talk about people who are of mixed race background as kind of three separate groups. And so that was a different concept. I actually think it's a better concept, but unfortunately both of those concepts here in the U.S. and in South Africa historically were used for discriminatory purposes, not good purposes. And as we have here in the U.S., and it still exists in South Africa, there's still a lot of prejudice in the society. Hopefully we're working it through as they are, but it still exists.
Mm-hmm. Now, what are some of the obstacles? We take a look at, trying to understand customs. We take a look at trying to understand the landscape and how people function, and obviously we've covered that there, but those seem to be just a few of the many obstacles, and some of those that you wouldn't think about. For instance, you were talking about the U.S. Embassy in your book and how they were really being concerned about areas, for instance, that may have sickness or disease, things like that. That must have been quite a challenge to deal with something like that.
Wendy, you want to take that one?
Sure. I think the concern of any new person going into a new developing country, and really that can be anywhere in the world, whether it's Africa or Latin America or Asia, you always are aware of germs and, not drinking the water and washing your hands thoroughly. Well, in Africa, that's kind of even more important. And there are diseases in Africa still that you have to take precautions against, and, malaria and, in some places Ebola, but other similar diseases, HIV is a big concern. So you just have to put it into your psyche to be very aware of where it is you're going and what it is you're doing. And the American Embassy, you register with them when you are inside a country in Africa, and they will send out bulletins on a regular basis that say, beware, do not go to here because an outbreak of such and such has occurred, or because there have been carjackings or other things. So the American Embassy takes a very active role in those kinds of countries for the protection of its citizens who are traveling and living there. But, on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of part of the back of your mind, but you're not really thinking about it and avoiding every person that you meet as a result. It's just kind of there, and you recognize it, and you go about your business, with just that extra caution in your mind.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is you kind of have to calibrate your brain as to what the level of risk is. I think the U.S. Embassy wants to be very cautious and err on the side of being overly cautious rather than to leave something out. And so you hear about carjackings or you hear about disease outbreaks, but you have to calibrate in your mind, just like in the U.S., there are carjackings or there are gang wars in inner cities and stuff like that, and most of us don't worry about that on a day-to-day basis. And so you have to kind of figure out, well, is this something that I have to worry about constantly, or if I just use common sense, can I go about my normal business? And it takes a while to get adjusted and to know how you interpret those warnings.
And our fellow Africans in the office, kind of help us with that calibration. They say, yes, I know they talk about it, but it's really this way in this area. Or, yeah, you really should be extra cautious. So we also could play off and integrate what our colleagues would be telling us about the real aspects of what the embassy would be talking about.
Mm-hmm.
When we went to Kenya, I got there before Wendy did, a couple of weeks before Wendy did. And in the first week that I got there, there were 2 fatal carjackings. And I thought, oh, my God, do they have this all the time? And our colleagues in the office said, no, this is very rare. There are people coming over, refugees from Somalia. They have guns from the wars that's been going on over there. They said, if something happens like that, just give in, give them the car, and don't worry about it. But we didn't have another fatal carjacking like that got in the news for the rest of the year that we were there. So you just have to be able to talk to people and calibrate and get a sense of what the risk really is.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that you probably found interesting, I'm sure, I know I would have, as you were there, was that you didn't really need to visit any zoos, did you? It's pretty much like the zoo kept coming to you guys.
Well, it's not quite like that, because we were living in the city, but
in Swaziland, we did have monkeys that came up to us, and
in our front yard, yeah.
In our front yard, so that was a little bit different. The first weekend we were there, I was my assignment was to create the website and blog and photos. So I was sitting and typing our first impressions, and on the windows of all of the apartments and homes, there are these iron grates, so nobody can come in even when the window is open. But this little arm stuck itself through right in front of me.
Monkeys can be quite selfish that way.
Oh, they're quite naughty. So his little arm was there, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and there it went. He figured it out that, no, I was not going to give him anything, and no, his little body was not going to slip through. So we just acknowledged each other's existence. But there were lots and lots of animals nearby, not necessarily right around our homes, but we miss seeing our animals in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely the case.
Now, from this whole experience, what would you say the two of you most took away from this that really sort of, I guess, invigorated you, so to speak?
Well, I think both of us took away a sense of people around the world, and particularly enterprising people. Those are the kind of people that TechnoServe wants to work with, wants to support, etc. There are people everywhere who want a better life for themselves. They want a better life for their family, and they work hard to make that difference. And so we got to work with a lot of them. They're very inspiring, and on a totally different economic level than most of us here in the U.S. are on. But they're trying to improve themselves, and we were trying to help them.
And I think the other thing we really appreciated and took back with us is how wonderful our colleagues were in the offices and in the facilities. They were so gracious. They went out of their way to take us places or to show us things. I wish that more Americans were that gracious and open to other people. It's certainly something that we felt was important to take back with us, to be offering people who are new or different, who are visiting an area, to really go out of our way, just the way the Africans were with us, particularly in the offices and the people that we got to know well. We've stayed in touch with a number of these people, and we've had a few of them come visit us, and they feel like family. So it's a real sense of warmth and graciousness that these people offer us, as well as how professional they are in the office and around us.
It's a marvelous story. The book is From Silicon Valley to Swaziland. It's how one couple found purpose and adventure in an Encore career, and that couple is Rick and Wendy Walleigh, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Is there a website people can find out more?
Yes, it is www.walleigh.com, and Walleigh is spelled Walleigh. So Walleigh.com, and there are lots of wonderful photos, and you can also read about success stories, which are some of the people that we met and came across and how they are changing their lives and their communities. So there are a bunch of those that I encourage people to look at and be inspired by, because these people have a lot less than we do and are making a difference in their lives and in their community. So Walleigh.com.
And it's interesting to note, too, based on what you just said there, Wendy, is the fact that when you go and you find out how people can be happy with much, much less than what we have for ourselves here in America, you start becoming more grateful. And it's in that gratitude that you start serving more. And as you serve more, you'll find out that you'll have more than you'll ever want or need in many cases. And I'm sure that was a big takeaway for you as well.
Well, and it also makes a difference of how you view your life. I feel like we are happier in our own lives because we have that perspective, and we're happier because we met these people. And we have a gratitude, as you said, about what we have and where we live, and we feel it's important to share what we have and where we live with other people. So we encourage and hope our book inspires people to give back and to show their gratitude for what they've been able to achieve. And everybody has something that they can contribute to other people. Time, not just money, but their skills, their experiences, their time can add so much value to other people's lives. And you don't have to travel across the globe to do that. You can do that in your own community. You can do it in your region. You can do it in your own local neighborhood. But it's important to share that gratitude with the people around you.
Well, you hit it right on the nail head. It is the golden rule. Everybody can do something.
Right. Right.
I want to thank both of you for being on the program today and sharing your story, as I love doing this because You hear so many people out there crusading, trying to think that they're going to change the world, or they want to, but then they do nothing because they realize it seems like an indomitable task. But the point is, find out what you can do, where you can apply that to, and that's all you need to do. And if other people see, it's like the dance floor. Once you see somebody up there dancing, everybody is going to join in kind, and you'll make a bigger impact than you can ever imagine, just like the two of you have.
Well, thank you. We believe that making a difference makes you feel better, as well as the people that you're helping.
Very good. Rick, any final thoughts?
Better to light one candle than to curse the darkness.
He would have to keep it simple, wouldn't he? Rick, Wendy, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Okay,
you're very welcome.
You.
Thank you for hosting us. We appreciate it.
You betcha. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. You can also find out more about From Silicon Valley to Swaziland by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.